Our next speaker is Professor Orest Subtelny, recently appointed to the Ukrainian Studies program in the Department of History in a tenure-track position, or actually tenured now, at York University in the History Department. I'd like him to begin the second topic, the Nazi-Soviet alliance, the first occupation of Western Ukraine. Professor Subtelny, would you like to begin?
The goal of my presentation is, first of all, to sketch the context in which Ukrainians had to make political choices during World War II, and specifically West Ukrainians living in Galicia. And the second point will, of course, be to focus our attention on Galicia, the area where the military units, which are now so much in the news, were formed. Galicia, a land of roughly, and a region of about 5 million people, 4 million of which were ethnic Ukrainians. The event that drew Ukrainians, and specifically West Ukrainians, into the war was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939. Now, this is one of the most mind-boggling diplomatic events of the century. I'm sure that most of you know the rough outlines of the pact. It consisted basically of 3 points, or 3 different parts. The first part was the rather standard declaration of non-aggression, where the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany agreed that they would not attack each other, maintain a relationship of non-aggression. This is a common phenomenon. Many countries sign these kinds of pacts. The second part was a commercial agreement in which the Soviets promised to deliver to the Nazis foodstuffs and raw supplies which were needed by Germany for its war effort. In return, the Nazis were to provide the Soviets with machinery, technology, and so forth. The terms of the second part were carried out for 18 months. That is, for 18 months, the Soviet Union, which kept the better part of the bargain, maintained its commitment much more so than Germany, supplied the Nazi Germany with raw supplies necessary for the Nazi war machine. The third part, of course, was politically the most important, and that was a secret agreement in which Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided up Eastern Europe into 2 spheres, all of Eastern Europe. Germany received as its sphere of influence Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Russia was given, assigned to its sphere of influence Turkey and Bulgaria, not as outright domination, but areas in their sphere of influence. And then Western Ukraine, or as it was then called, Eastern Poland, the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Bessarabia. Now, this was this famous division of Eastern Europe that occurred in 1939 between these 2 powers. This has been a much debated political deal. What is striking in this debate is that when the point is brought up that the Soviets were in effect collaborating with Nazi Germany for 18 months and in effect allowed Hitler to begin World War I and were therefore a party to the beginning of the war, when these points are brought up, Soviets insist, and many historians in the West agree, that one should look at the context in which this arrangement was made. And it's argued that the Soviets were afraid that the West was turning Hitler against them, and therefore, in a kind of self-defense move, they made an agreement with Hitler before the West did. There are various other explanations for the pact that was made. What should concern us here, though, is the willingness, both of Western historians and very often Western public opinion, if one reads the newspapers, to accept the context in which this arrangement was made. People look at the context. They don't point and say it was collaboration, but they insist that a context be accepted and analyzed. Now, This is important, of course, for Ukrainians because very often the question of context is always left out when Ukrainian issues are brought up. But the prime case of collaboration, and the bottom line was that it was collaboration, the context is always taken into account. And there is a very serious inconsistency in approaching the actions of the Soviet Union, for example, in this pact, and not applying the same kind of logic to other actors in World War II. And of course it is striking that when the Soviet evidence is used against collaborators, some 18-year-old who didn't know what he was doing is accused of being a collaborator. This is raised by a world power that knowingly, consciously, and very importantly, on a massive scale, collaborated with Nazi Germany for 18 months of the war. The significance of this pact for East Europeans was of the greatest magnitude. The one thing that came out of it was that Eastern Europe was divided between two totalitarian regimes. Specifically for the Ukrainians of Galicia, this meant that there were only two choices, two possibilities open: Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. There were no other alternatives for Ukrainians and for Balts and for many other people in Eastern Europe. These terrible options, Hitler and the Nazis or the Soviet Union and Stalin. This point also must be emphasized. This very often people approach World War II from the Western perspective, where there was a Hitler and then there were French Free Forces, the resistance, and what have you. Such alternatives. That you only had the one problem of Hitler. In Eastern Europe, this was not the case. Specifically in Ukraine and the Baltic, there were the two problems. And therefore, one cannot expect people to say, you should have fought Hitler. There was the other problem of the Soviet Union. There were two problems to face, and this, of course, complicated the situation in Eastern Europe, and, of course, behooves us to examine it as a more complex situation that existed in the West. It was not always clear whom to resist. The second aspect of the pact that has a broader significance is that it was a very dramatic and in a way the ultimate demonstration that peoples, that states make decisions on the basis of their immediate interests. Nations will make pacts, states will make pacts with the devil if it serves their interests in the given moment. This is, of course, obvious. This is not new, but this was a dramatic demonstration of this principle. The Allies really did similar things. The Allies, certainly America, England, France, for decades were rabidly anti-Soviet, tried to topple the Soviet Union in the 1920s. They made an alliance with Stalin during the war, and then right after the war, back to the Cold War. The interests of the moment dominated. It was self-interest. There was no countless cases of this tendency can be brought up. Morality was not the issue. Immediate interests, immediate pressures were the issue. And therefore, when people acted in World War II, they were not acting and wondering what people in Toronto 45 years later will think. They were acting on what they had to do in a given situation. So, to summarize this part, the dilemma of the Ukrainians in Galicia specifically, and other peoples in Eastern Europe, was in one sense unique. They had the two problems, the problem of the Soviets and the problem of the Nazis. Very few other nations in Europe faced this kind of dilemma. On the other hand, it was typical in that in a difficult political situation, they would have to make decisions that fitted into their political interest and had to be guided by their political interests. No moralizing. No one had the luxury of moralizing and choosing the morally correct route. Expediency had to be followed as is followed in most of such cases. Now, if one is to look at the choices that Ukrainians would and could make, one has to look at their past experience. One cannot, of course, judge from hindsight how terrible was this partner or that partner. One has to judge what people experienced in the past in order to realize how they acted in a given moment. People act on the basis of their immediate past experiences, not what becomes evident later on. In the case of the Ukrainians, and specifically the Ukrainians of Galicia, the two choices that were available to them were, of course, the Soviets or the Nazis. It would become later apparent. It can be said it was obvious to the Ukrainians that, viewed from their past experience, the Soviets had to be seen as the greater enemy. The attempts of the Ukrainians in 1917 to 1920 to establish their independence were thwarted by the Soviets. So there was a recent conflict in which the Soviets were perceived as the enemy that thwarted a very concerted effort at independent statehood. In the 1930s, it was the Soviets that imposed collectivization, which led to the well-known famine and 5, 6, 7 million deaths. It was the Soviets who in 1937 instituted the purges, actually much earlier, throughout the 30s, instituted the purges that liquidated the flower of the Ukrainian intelligentsia in Soviet Ukraine. And then finally, of course, it was the Soviets who in 1939 invade Galicia and impose a Soviet regime on the Galicians, Western Ukrainians. The point is that it was the Soviets who were inherently opposed to Ukrainian nationalism and attempts to establish a Ukrainian state by definition. There could be no compromise between Ukrainian national interests, Ukrainian attempts to establish a state, and the Soviet Union. It was excluded. It was impossible. In this context, the Soviets had to, as I repeat again, be seen as the ultimate enemy for Ukrainians. And this became quite obvious in September 1939, September 17th, 1939, when Soviet armies acting on the force of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact entered into Western Ukraine. The occupation of Western Ukraine, which lasted 18 months, September 1939 to June 1941, occurred in two phases, two rather distinct phases, two aspects of this occupation. In the first phase, the Soviets made an attempt to win the hearts and minds of the population. They were almost forced to do this. The argument for their entry into Western Ukraine was that they were coming to help their brothers, their brethren, the Ukrainians and Belarusians in Poland. This was the formal argument put forth in world opinion and formal statements by the Soviet Union that their intervention in Poland, their cooperation in aiding Hitler to dismember the Polish state, was motivated by the fact that the ethnic minorities of Poland, and specifically the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, were mistreated, were exploited by the Polish state and by the Polish upper classes. Therefore, they were coming to the aid of the Ukrainians in the West. Given this fact, they had to make it appear that they were wanted by the people they were coming to aid. Therefore, this first phase had to be a rather gentle approach to the Ukrainians. Aspects of this occupation, the first phase, were, you might call, Ukrainian, emphasized the Ukrainian and the democratic. The general who led his troops into Galicia was General Timoshenko, and obviously a Ukrainian name. The part of the Soviet front that entered was the Ukrainian front that entered Galicia. All this was to show that Ukrainians were coming to the help of Ukrainians. The democratic aspect, the most famous case, was the election of October 1922, where the Soviets organized an election in which the population was strongly encouraged to participate, and which was to elect a national assembly, which then turned to Moscow and requested annexation of Western Ukraine into the Soviet Union. Point here, the emphasis on democratic, supposedly democratic moves was paramount. These type of tactics would later be used, of course, in Eastern Europe in the cases of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria after World War II. There were other aspects to the initial occupation that were in many ways positive as far as Ukrainians were concerned. One may generally put this under the category of Ukrainianizations. When the Soviets came in, Ukrainian, which had been Ukrainian culture, and the development of Ukrainian culture, which had been inhibited severely by the Poles, was allowed to flower. Ukrainian language was heard in view as the primary language, and in all of Western Ukraine. Ukrainian newspapers came to dominate. Great efforts were made to develop the school system. Ukrainians had difficulties entering establishments of higher education. The Soviets opened up the university to Ukrainians. They multiplied the number of primary schools, and Ukrainian became the language in these schools. They did a lot of work in the area of healthcare. So they instituted, in general, policies that were designed to win the support of the local population. But at the same time as this was being done, certain steps were being instituted to deprive Ukrainians of any kind of ability to express themselves politically. When the Soviets first came in, they began a systematic arrest and deportation to the Soviet Union of the previous political leadership. Thus, the leadership of UNDO, those who had not managed to escape before, was arrested. The Ukrainian biggest parties, which tended to be center liberal parties, were disbanded. Their leaders were deported to the Soviet Union. This was very important because this meant that the biggest Ukrainian parties, those representing most liberal tendencies, were destroyed. This left only the parties that were prepared for an underground existence, the more extreme parties who were capable of acting. Thus, it was the Soviets who really destroyed the middle ground in Galicia and left only the extreme capable of acting. And this, and let us say, the nationalists, the OUN, acted because they had an underground structure which could not be readily destroyed. Therefore, they survived where the other parties could not. These arrests indicated that another aspect of Soviet policy was about to appear quite soon, and it did roughly in the middle of 1940. Even before Galicia was accepted into the Soviet Union, the Soviets began to impose their laws and their administration, redivided the country according to Soviet lines, Soviet models. As I mentioned, they banned political parties. This was done immediately, but soon after they began to liquidate all Ukrainian institutions. And one has to know the history of Galicia to know with what effort various Ukrainian self-help societies, insurance companies, the Prosvita organization, strictly cultural organizations, were developed over generations through the blood, sweat, and tears of very often uneducated peasants. These were immediately banned, or soon banned, and the entire Ukrainian infrastructure was destroyed systematically by the Soviets. They instituted the nationalization of trade. They did they did a kind of an about-face, or rather clever move as far as their agricultural policy was concerned. When they came in order to win popular opinion, they made a great show of redistributing the land. That is, they expropriated Polish landlords, sent most of them to Siberia, and took the land and gave it to the peasants, telling them it's yours. This was a wonderful move, great propaganda move. But soon after then, they came to the peasants and said, now that you have the land, you should begin collectivizing and combining your land in collectives. So after that initial redistribution of land, which was psychologically a rather facile move, they instituted collectivization in the second phase. Now that you have your land, bring it together, and they tried to impose the same system. In fact, they began to impose the same system that existed in Soviet Ukraine and that was resisted by Soviet Ukrainian peasants. It was at this point that the peasantry rejected Soviets outright. Initially, they treated the church with kid gloves. They did not ban the church. They simply imposed certain restrictions. By 1940, mid-1940, they began to impose serious restrictions on the church, especially on the priests, giving them special passports, passport number 1, which immediately identified the individual as a priest, raising taxes on them, imposing all sorts of technical difficulties that would not allow them to carry out their duties. And then by the end of 40 and early 1941, they began to institute well-known secret police, system of informers, and arrests began. The arrests were aimed first and foremost at anyone active in the nationalist movement, and this was defined very broadly. Anyone active in any kind of Ukrainian activities, not necessarily in the narrow sense of un nationalist, but cultural activities, commercial activities, anything that was linked with Ukrainian insurance company or something. That was considered Ukrainian activity, and arrests of these people began. They were carried on until throughout the spring of 1941, and by June 1941, the prisons of Western Ukraine were packed with individuals who had been arrested, sometimes for the most innocuous reasons. It was at this point that the Nazis made their surprise attack on the Soviet Union. And the reaction of the Soviets at this point to the people whom they had under arrest, to the people they were governing, is most telling, because this is the point when they panic, when they began to retreat fast, and where their true face became quite evident to the population. In order not to lose any of the prisoners they had, the Soviets instituted a policy simply of massacring everyone in the prisons. Not only were these people massacred, and I should add that they were not only the Ukrainians, there were Poles, Jews in these prisons also. For example, the Communist Party of Western Ukraine was severely repressed, and the Communist Party had a large percentage of Jews, and many of these Jews died at this point. In any case, the panicky retreat led them to massacre the prisoners. And as the Soviets left, Ukrainians came to these prisons to find their relatives, and they found these horrendous mounds of massacred people who were massacred not only in the traditional way of a shot in the back of the head, but there were almost every case in every city indications of the most sadistic dismemberments and other kinds of tortures carried out on these people. Very often in the last minutes when the Soviets left, they simply shut the doors of prisons and burnt them down with their inmates. They blew them up so that everyone was buried alive, things of this sort. The systematic approach which they used, a definition of the enemies that they had were quite broad, as I mentioned before. Lists of prisoners or people who were to be arrested by the Soviets were found, for example, in the city of Stanislavl. The city had roughly 60,000 population in 1939. The Soviet list for people who should be arrested and liquidated included 5,000 names. So it was 5,000 out of 60,000, and you can see that the proportion of the population that was slated for liquidation on the basis of this one list. And these kind of lists were found in most cities, but the one in Stanislavia was the most complete that we have. In general, when the figures are totaled up, and it's difficult to total up because very many cases, all the bodies could not be exhumed, but something between approximately 15,000 people were massacred in those jails in those last moments of the Soviet retreat. In addition, tens of thousands were arrested by the Soviets and sent into exile in Siberia and to Kazakhstan points east. So one can estimate that over 100,000 people were repressed, killed, exiled during those last moments of the Soviet retreat before they had begun what was to be a purge of the West Ukrainian population. 100,000 in a population of roughly 5 million is a very serious figure, and it was the impact of these last moments of the Soviet retreat when the Ukrainian population, which did not need much proof, and it was never really convinced by Soviet policies, realized the type of people they were dealing with. It was this event especially that spread among West Ukrainians a kind of horror Sovieticus. The impact of the Soviet occupation of Galicia was so strong and so negative by the time they left that Ukrainians in Western Ukraine were convinced that these were the worst. Well, it needed very little convincing. They were only redoubled in their conviction that the Soviets always were and would continue to be the worst enemy for the Ukrainians. And it would be the relatives of many of these people who were massacred in the last moments of the Soviet retreat who would, of course, volunteer for various military units to fight the Soviets and the Soviets alone, as will be pointed out later. And it would be relatives and West Ukrainians who would join the mass exodus in 1944, which was prompted by the very idea of Soviets returning. This horror Sovieticus, the horror of being occupied by Soviets again, was so strong that it impelled hundreds of thousands of people to leave their homes to avoid another Soviet occupation. And of course, this moment, these events must be remembered when one considers what happens later in Western Ukraine. To summarize my presentation, I have 3 points then to make. The first point, as far as Ukrainians are concerned, in the early phases of the war, is that Ukrainians had the problem of facing the Soviets and the Nazis. There were two totalitarian regimes. There were two murderous regimes operating in Ukraine, not one. This must be remembered. The second point is that given the experience of the Ukrainians over the past 20 years prior to the war, and specifically during the 18 months from September 1939 to June 1941, it is not surprising that Ukrainians should perceive the Soviets as the primary enemy. And three, that when the time came to make political decisions, Ukrainians would make political decisions according to lines of immediate political concern, immediate political needs. Not ideology, not morality, no one could afford it, but immediate political needs. Everyone has done this before and continues to do it now. The Ukrainians only made decisions on the same basis as everyone else did. Thank you very much.
Well, as one of the organizers, I'm very surprised and very pleased that we in fact have ended much earlier than intended, which will give our speakers, other speakers, even more time. And will also put Professor Subtelny on the spot to speak both for Professor Shpurluk and for, of course, himself. Before you have a chance to write, in fact, let's give you a chance to write down the questions if you have any. I'd like to just briefly check with you if in your information package everything was properly distributed. You should have received a chronology of events, a very basic chronology, a selected reading list, the program, of course, a list of donors on the orange sheet, and I think the terms of inquiry, the Canadian inquiry, that are going to be, that's headed up by Justice Deschênes. If you're missing any of these, I'd like to ask you to go to the registration table and you'll be given those later on.